are there any fantasy books or series that you found especially authentic? And his other question was, what does a HEMA competition look like?
All right. I'll start with the HEMA competition. There's plenty of video. If you want to just look up HEMA tournament on YouTube, you'll find lots of it. Generally speaking, the uniform of HEMA tournaments is typically people in all black. It looks somewhat similar to Olympic-style sport fencing outfit, except everything's thicker. The helmets have padding that comes down on the side and on the back of the head. The jackets are much thicker because we're using things like we're using weapons like this to strike people with, and and it's quite a bit different than a little saber or a foil. You will also frequently see padding or hard padding on the elbows and knees, and it's in a three-dimensional arena. It's like in a square or a circle as opposed to like on a strip in Olympic-style sport fencing. So in most HEMA tournaments, you'll have a referee in the middle and a series of judges. And when they call for action, they call for go. You go until there's a hit and they call halt. And then they'll reset, assign the score, and go again for either a certain amount of time or a certain amount of hits. And, you can hit on the arm, you can hit on the head, you can hit on the legs, and sometimes there's a point value assessed. The rules to each individual tournament are slightly different depending on the tournament and what they want to do. And sometimes they allow grappling and throws. Sometimes they try to discourage it. So it really just depends on the tournament. But generally speaking, it's a kind of a start and stop tournament setup. Where they're striking and trying, and some will penalize people for double hits or getting what's called an after hit. If you hit somebody and a split second later they hit you, that's bad. So you're penalized for allowing yourself to get hit, even if it's a split second later. So
that whole getting stabbed second idea.
Right. Yeah. And so it's definitely entertaining. Take a look. Yeah. And just, search for HEMA tournaments, and there's plenty of footage to look at.
Now, are there any greats out there, like just incredible swordsmen or masters out there teaching, or maybe on YouTube, that you actually look to as heroes or mentors, or just especially good sources for material?
I'll pass on the masters idea. It's one of these things that's kind of not really a controversy, but something that's discussed a lot, and I personally have my opinions on it. Typically, we don't use the term master in our modern study of it. In my opinion, it's considered a dead martial art because there has not been an unbroken line of lineage from the time period. And so we're trying our best to recreate it. And obviously there's nobody alive that knows what it's like to get into an actual real life and death longsword fight. So can you really master something that you don't ever actually do? And there's some opinions, one way or the other on that. And I kind of feel that, you can't really. I think there's some very good instructors out there. At the risk of calling out some people and leaving some people out, and I won't say I think this person's a great sword fighter, or this person isn't. One of my favorite sources for good material, though, I'll mention it, is Matt Easton. He has a YouTube channel. He works out of a school in London, I think it's in London, or at least in England, called Schola Gladiatoria. And he really knows the stuff, especially the history of weapons. And he actually, I think, is part owner in an antique weapons dealership. So he has all sorts of fun toys to look at, and he always has good material. So that's one source that I personally look to for really good information. And I agree with him like 98% of the time. So, Matt Easton.
Matt Easton, Schola Gladiatoria?
Gladiatoria, yes.
Gladiatoria. Excellent. We have another question from the chat from One Bite Cake is the username.
Who doesn't like cake?
I got to admit, One Bite Cake, that really has to do with how dedicated you are. Am I right? One bite cake for one person might take another person a bit longer. I'm just saying, there's some
dedication.
Yeah.
I love it.
Anyway, the question is, what about axes and fighting with axes? Is that like the maces where it's more like, club the other person as hard as you can, or is there some finesse there with axes as well?
We have yet to discover any historic manuals that specifically deal with hand axes and fighting. Now, obviously, you can extrapolate by experimenting with it. Especially when you're working with things like shields and stuff like that. The head of the axe is really good at hooking things and pulling things, allowing you to open up things. So a lot of it is an experimental kind of archaeology study and experimental martial arts, because we don't have any actual manuals on using the axe. Now, we do have plenty of information on using a pole axe, which is a
Really?
taller axe on a pole, and usually has some sort of hammer on one end and then the axe head on the other, usually a pointy thing up on top. There is a good amount of material on the pole axe, which was used all over Europe. And so German, Italian, even English sources all have manuals that talk about the poleaxe. And the study of that, you're using a lot of the haft of the thing to try and wind and get an opening, hook people behind the legs or hook people behind the head, pull them down, and then thrust and stab. Or there are definitely some good techniques that are described with the poleaxe. But as far as hand axes go, there's just not a lot of material on that.
I have to ask, are there poleaxe competitions at HEMA competitions?
There's not a whole lot of them because of the nature of the weapon. It creates a whole lot of inertia.
That was hence my question, because I don't know, short of plate armor, how you could ever do that safely, because of the mass and the speed.
Yeah, in the HEMA format, because of the lack of protection, it's really difficult to do that. Now, there are some people that are experimenting. I've seen with axe heads made out of leather or some kind of synthetic material like nylon. Some practice swords, like this one here, it's made out of a nylon material, and so it bends quite a bit. And this is a long sword that's made out of it. It's a synthetic material, and so some people are making axe heads and things out of this stuff, which it's got a much thicker edge, which displaces some of the impact, but it's still it packs a huge hit. Now, the other aspect of all this is that outside of HEMA, there is another group that engages in historical fighting, and it's usually referred to as bowhurt or armored fighting. And this stuff is people getting in full steel armor, or armor plating, things like brigadines and things like that, and using blunt steel, and it's full bore, and they use a lot of axes. They use a lot of halberds and pole arms, and a lot of people describe it as MMA with armor. It's not a perfect comparison, but yeah, bowhurt or historic armored combat is something to look for. There's the Super Bowl of armored fighting is a competition called Battle of the Nations, and it's usually held somewhere in Europe, either usually in they've had it in Rome, and they've had it in Spain and Russia. Russia's really where it came. They were the ones that came up with this sport, and it's basically an armored version of what a tournament must have been like, or they're trying to recreate the tournament atmosphere using full armored, full contact steel fighting. Wow. And it is a sight to see. And in addition to duels, they're really known for having mass battles. So melees, they'll have 5-on-5, sometimes 10-on-10. One tournament, they even had 150 on 150, and it was massive. It was amazing to see. Did
everyone live?
They did.
Wow.
People do get hurt, but the armor works. The armor does its job for the most part. And, it's really a spectacular sight to see. I'm part of a group here in Colombia called the Palmetto Knights, and most of the people on the team do this style of fighting. They do this armored fighting, and they go overseas and compete, and it's pretty spectacular. And they get after it. They hit hard. It's really just a sight to see.
I was going to ask, because you speak very glowingly about these groups, I was going to ask if this was like, your HEMA rivals.
In a sense, yes. One of the biggest points of contention between HEMA and the Bohurt crowd, Bohurt fighting. If you're actually trying to kill somebody in armor, you don't hit the armor. You don't hack at it and slash at the armor because you can't cut through the armor.
It's also going to mess up your sword.
It can ding up your sword, but you'll probably be dead before it does too much damage. But the actual strategy to beat somebody in armor is to use a technique called half swording. It's where you actually grip the blade of your sword and you use it for leverage to try and thrust it between the gaps of the armor. So it's wrestling with a sword. And then you're trying to, whine and trip and throw people, get them on the ground. If you can get them on the ground, you can always pull out, the short and stabbies, and you're trying to get it into the gaps of the armor, into the slit of the helmet, underneath the helmet, in the armpit, behind the knee, in the groin, anywhere where the armor isn't. That is how you beat somebody in armor. You don't cut. However, because that's the effective way to kill somebody, you're not allowed to do that in the Bohurt sport because people would actually really get killed. Yeah. So, and it is documented that back in the day when they had these tournaments, a lot of them did not allow thrusting for that very reason. So they would hold these tournaments. They said you can only use the edge for hitting and striking, and so that's basically the rule set that they work with. No thrusting, because that is actually how you kill somebody. So HEMA, who is much more concerned with historical accuracy, not necessarily historical accuracy, but how to actually fight and kill people with these weapons, will look at that and say, well, that's ridiculous because you'll never kill anybody doing that. And Bohurt says, well, it's, working for us. And besides that, we're recreating the tournament setting where they actually don't use thrusting. So they'll go back and forth. And it's my Kung Fu is better than your Kung Fu. In my opinion, it's all good. It's all fun. They're just different avenues. And so far, HEMA has not jumped on the melee wagon. And that's certainly something that's really exciting to see is fields full of people going at it. And that's very entertaining. But yeah, there is kind of a rivalry between the two sports.
I think I might have met one of those people. I was in Ukraine in a city I think called Lugansk. It's not that I don't know what the town was called. I think it was while I was there. And I met this guy who had hair down to his shoulders. And it was in the middle of winter in Ukraine. And he didn't even have a jacket on. And he stalked everywhere, right? He just strode and just picked up snow to hold it in his hands while it melted. And later he showed us, this plate armor that he had been making. And these axes that he had been making, talking about he and his friends would get together and they'd all made this armor and they would just come together and go at it. And I just had that memory come back. I think this must have been one of these Bohurt guys.
I absolutely think so too. In fact, most of the weapons and armor that people import for that sport come from Ukraine and from Russia and from some of those other Eastern Bloc countries, because they've been doing it for years and years and years. And so they've really figured out how to make these sporting tools and the sporting armor in a relatively cheap and safe manner for this craft.